Thanks very much, Tony, and thanks to Psychosis Australia. It's great to be here today and with you all. As Tony says, I'm Julia. I'm a psychiatrist working in Sydney, and I'm going to talk today about cognitive remediation therapy, which is a really important intervention which is evidence-based to improve not just cognition but also functioning in people who are living with psychosis and schizophrenia. So I'd just like to start with an acknowledgement of country and of lived experience. I know that the conference has been opened with an acknowledgement, so I won't read it out, but just to note how important this is. Thanks. And then I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for the basis of my work. I've spent the last 5 years leading the tertiary referral service for psychosis, which was a New South Wales-based clinical service designed to try to improve outcomes for people living with psychosis. I've since stepped back from that role to run the cognitive remediation project, which I'm going to talk about today. But really, the underpinning principles of my work throughout these years have been that really, in order to support people, we really need to take a whole person approach and think about what are their needs, not just in terms of clinical symptoms, which are important, of course, essential to address, but also trying to listen to what their needs are and recognizing that people can live autonomous, contributing, and satisfying lives in the community, even in the presence of ongoing symptoms. Something which hasn't received a huge amount of focus over the years is that many people who, not all, but many people who experience psychosis can have difficulties with their thinking and memory. And we call these thinking difficulties cognitive symptoms, and they can very much be part of the illness. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those during the course of the talk so that we understand what we're trying to target with cognitive remediation therapy. I'll then provide you with a bit of background on why and how we know that cognitive remediation therapy works. And then I'll talk about the program that we're running across New South Wales and also in a site in Queensland. I'll then talk you through exactly what's involved in undertaking cognitive remediation and tell you a little bit about how we're going with our implementation program. So to start then, let's talk about cognitive symptoms or thinking difficulties experienced by people who are living with psychosis or schizophrenia. Many people with psychosis will experience a generalized impairment in their thinking skills. These issues are often present right at the time of illness onset. They may even have been present earlier than illness onset in some people who have had difficulties throughout childhood, who may already have a vulnerability for the future development of psychosis. And importantly, cognitive difficulties often go undetected because we're not looking for them, we don't recognize them, we don't talk about them really enough. The best way to really understand the difficulties that a given individual has with their thinking skills is to complete what's called a neuropsychological assessment by a skilled psychologist. And that really is best practice, and that's something that we should be aiming for as part of gold standard care. But what are these difficulties that people have with their thinking? Well, on the screen, these are just some of them. So there's a generalized slowing in people's ability to process information. Their attention might be scatty and poor. They have reduced ability to take on new information, verbal learning, and reduced working memory, and poor reasoning and problem solving. These may be things that you understand about a person that you know who has psychosis, but you may not have actually thought, oh, that's because they've got thinking difficulties, that's because they've got these cognitive symptoms. But actually we know that treatments like cognitive remediation can really help with these cognitive difficulties and help people learn how to think about thinking and develop strategies that really help them with day-to-day thinking, memory, attention, and therefore better ability to function. Other difficulties related to thinking that people with psychosis can experience are sociocognitive difficulties, and these are listed here. These are people's reduced ability perhaps to recognize another person's intention or another person's emotion. These are less well targeted by cognitive remediation programs. There are other treatments that are being developed with a view to try and address some of these difficulties, but I won't really be talking about these very much more today. And why is cognition and thinking important? It's important because it is the best predictor of how someone is going to manage day to day in their life. The best predictor of how they function day to day, that is, you know, do they have a partner? Do they have a job? Are they involved in the community? Things that are important as part of having a contributing, satisfying, fulfilling life. So we know that cognitive difficulties account for much of the functional impairments seen in people with psychosis, including unemployment, reduced community access, and reduced social networks. But we also know that our pharmacological treatments don't address or improve thinking difficulties. So we need other treatments to do that. And we know that cognitive remediation therapy can improve both thinking skills and function. So what is cognitive remediation therapy? Well, it's a range of psychological treatments which can be delivered by pen and paper, but mostly these days are delivered by computerized programs which have been developed in order to tailored for people with psychosis and their particular cognitive difficulties. As I've said, it improves cognition and function, and we know also that it's recognized in Australian guidelines as something that everybody should have access to, but unfortunately, it's the same old story. There isn't access. People aren't trained to deliver it. There's no money. There's no time. We know from work really pioneered by Prof. Till Wykes back in London, who set up the wonderful Circuits Cognitive Remediation Therapy program, that CRT works well. We also know that there's lots of meta-analyses that have been done over the past 10, 20 years showing how well it works. And in summary, most of the studies have shown that cognitive remediation has a positive effect in improving people's function. Most of the studies show that it also has a positive effect in improving people's clinical outcomes, which is an unexpected finding, but nonetheless very valuable. It may be as people feel more connected and more able to do things that in turn they, you know, for whatever reason, generally improve. It has some benefits on total and negative symptoms, but those aren't really what's being targeted, so those aren't the main things that we've seen improvement in. Cognitive remediation works particularly well for people who had fewer years of education, who perhaps weren't as high on the IQ scale even before they developed their illness, and people who have high baseline symptom severity. So in some ways, the people who are more unwell, more challenged educationally or IQ-wise, improve more. They're the ones that we see a greater improvement with. But it's very important that we deliver cognitive remediation in a way that's sort of true to the model, which could talk about fidelity of delivery. So we need to have therapists who are trained, who know what they're doing, who structure the tasks appropriately, and very importantly, who integrate the benefits that people are making in their thinking with real life bridging exercises. So for example, you learn how to make a list. The next day you go and practice going to the supermarket with your list. So you actually put these theoretical improvements into real life practice. That's how we see the change in function. I'm just going to really briefly touch on some of the evidence. I just want to emphasize how clearly we now understand that cognitive remediation works. It's just that we need to implement it. So this meta-analysis, which gathered together information from a large number of studies over many years, 73 studies, almost 5,000 patients, showed that thinking skills or cognition improved greatly with cognitive remediation, and that also there's an improvement in functional outcomes. And again, this idea that improved cognitive outcomes, including these bridging groups, the bridging is the matching of a skill learned in cognitive remediation to a real-life practice. And another meta-analysis which shows much the same thing, improvement in cognition, improvement in function, but we need an active, trained therapist and structured development of strategies. I was actually, I think my first Psychosis Australia conference was in Sydney about 8 years ago. I moved to Sydney only about 11 years ago. And at that time, we were talking about cognitive remediation and what a great intervention it was. And Prof. Wykes came across from London and talked to us all about it, and there was great enthusiasm. Here we are 10 years later, and well, I'm taking you back 1 year ago, actually, so maybe 9 years later, and still there wasn't access to cognitive remediation for people living with psychosis in New South Wales, where I'm based. And so together with one of the key pioneers of CogRem in Australia, who's Matt Thomas, who's based at Charles Sturt University, we got together as a group, a working party, and wrote this editorial talking about how important cognitive remediation is. We've got the evidence base. How do we implement it? And you'll notice that a lot of these names who form part of this group also are present on this slide, because what that editorial, that piece of work that we all did together, we got together, we really wanted to make a difference. We wanted to implement cognitive remediation. And it led us to then apply for funding, and we were fortunate to be successful in an MRFF grant, which has allowed us to have $4 million across 5 sites in New South Wales and Queensland to actually put this into practice. So Jan was talking earlier about, how do we move things forward? I think this is part of it. This is working together, being passionate about an idea, and moving it forward until you get the funds that allow you to actually make a difference. So I'm going to move on now to talking a little bit about what these monies have actually allowed us to do. They've allowed us to train clinicians across all those hospital sites, 5 local health districts in New South Wales and Queensland. We've got clinicians probably across 20+ hospitals and community settings now, being trained up in cognitive remediation, and specifically in this program, which is called Circuits, which stands for Cognitive Interactive Remediation of Cognition. But for our purposes, we can call it Circuits. And this is the program that was designed by Prof. Wykes and her team in London. And it's a really lovely, fluid program. It interfaces, it's got a whole village setting, you've got a town, you've got a library, you've got a store. And in that setting, different tasks are set and achieved. I'll talk a little bit about exactly what cognitive remediation is so that you understand what it would be like for an individual to undertake it. It's a challenging commitment. People don't have to, but ideally, you would meet with a therapist either one-to-one or in a group, 3 times a week for up to 3 to 6 months, and work really in a disciplined and committed way, working on tasks that are set for you, tailored to you. And these tasks could target attention, working memory, executive function. The tasks difficulty varies, but essentially what we're trying to do is enable people to get about 80 or 90% success on all the tasks, because that encourages them to stay involved, stay engaged, and keep improving. There's a therapist present at all times. This is really core to the way that we deliver CogRem. We don't think that, well, we know from the meta-analyses that I showed you that just delivering CogRem without a therapist, it just doesn't work as well. The therapist talks to the person about what are their goals. You know, I'd like to get my driver's license, or I'd like to be able to get a job. And then they establish targets and tailored tasks within the circuits program with the ultimate goal of helping them achieve that goal. But naturally, there's going to be lots of small steps along the way. As I said before, it's really essential that we have high levels of positive reinforcement and encouragement. So we're trying to help people feel confident, feel that they're motivated to continue. And essentially, they're learning about their thinking, normalizing the use of strategies so that they use them over and over, and then they start to become habit. And then I talked a little bit before about this idea of the transfer bridge to functioning. This is really key to the improvement in functioning. So tasks that are thinking tasks that are seen in the computerized program are then talked about actively with the participant, and the therapist will then develop a challenge or a goal for them to achieve the next day or the next few days in the real life setting. Some of the other principles of CogRem I won't go into too much, but these are based in cognitive science principles, ways to help people learn. It's not just about new strategies, it's also about repetitively practicing a skill over and over again. So it is effortful for the individual. Generally, though, if you get people through the first sort of 4 or 5 sessions, they really start to feel the improvement and notice the improvement and come back. And that's really what we're aiming for, to take them the whole way with this model. And finally, this idea of errorless learning, so encouraging people to stay engaged by giving them about 80-90% success rate. And scaffolding is another way to help people take on board a new strategy or a new skill, providing them with examples, demonstrating things to them, using things that are relevant to them. And this is where the one-to-one relationship with the therapist is really key. That therapist understands from the baseline assessment what the individual's challenges are, and also understands what their goals are. And so the whole program is really very tailored. Now, cognitive remediation ideally is delivered face-to-face. There seem to be benefits just with the connection that people experience. When we started, it was back in the time of the pandemic, so we did deliver it for some time online. That was naturally a one-to-one, but now that we're through that, we tend to only do the online delivery when there are people who live rurally or remotely. It's also really great to have the flexibility of being able to deliver it online, because of course there are many people who live, 3-4 hours away from their health centre. They don't need to go there twice a week for CogRem. They can be supported to sit at the computer, for example, with their NDIS support worker, and that support worker can also assist with bridging tasks and so on. So there's lots of ways that the therapy can be contributed to, not just by the individual, but also by their wider family and support. We also run a group program where I'm based in Sydney, and we have up to 6 people working together, each at their own computer. They're all working on their own programs, but there's something nice about coming to a communal space, and there is some sort of interaction between people, which is very much enjoyed. So I've really explained the principles of COGRAM, why it's important, and I just wanted to finish in the last few minutes telling you about the progress that we've made so far with the funds from the MRFF, which have allowed us to implement COGRAM. Our first part of the project, phase 1, was implementation planning, and this was coming together of all the stakeholders, so people with lived experience, clinicians, researchers, policymakers, the executive, the managers in the hospital setting. What would they allow us to do? What would it be possible for us to do? Would they support clinicians to have time out of their current caseload in order to take on the not insignificant task of working with an individual twice a week for an hour for, up to 6 months? And it was really heartening to be part of that implementation planning workshop. We had some really great discussions, and the outputs of that were that we developed an agreement that there would be an informal contract for all clinicians, that they could go to their line manager and say, I'm taking the COGRAM training, so I'm going to need some study leave to do that, and then I'm going to need some extra time in my caseload to start delivering cognitive remediation. We also were able to provide 12 cognitive remediation training spots, and we've created 2 clinical coordinator positions. So these are people, neuropsychologists who are skilled in COGRAM, who supervise all the newly trained clinicians and who manage all the referrals for COGRAM coming in. And what's really important about those positions is that we really hope that now that they're established, once the MRFF project funds dry up, which they will eventually around early 2029, we hope that those positions will be maintained within our health district so that cognitive remediation can be continued as part of core care moving forward. So we've begun recruitment. We have 10 clinicians already trained with some capacity to offer COGRAM. This is just at our site in Sydney, and this will be happening also in the other sites across New South Wales and Queensland. We have, that's right, so various other of those New South Wales teams have also commenced COGRAM, and we are seeking feedback from clinicians and participants about their views on COGRAM so that we have an ongoing iterative process for feedback and developing the program so that it really is meeting people's needs. I just want to leave you with a few quotes. These ones are, I think, reasonably easy to read, so I'll let you read those yourselves. So these are really heartening comments from people just talking about how they feel better able to problem solve, better able to do mental gymnastics, better able to engage in conversation, put their voice, have their voice heard in a conversation, in any setting. And Kevin here on the right says, if we hadn't had the opportunity to give feedback on the COGRAM, I wouldn't have had the skills to give feedback, and he's now able to do that in other settings too. I also just wanted to share this testimonial from Marnie. That isn't her real name, but this is a person living rurally who received COGRAM for telehealth with the support of an NDIS support worker. And it is difficult to read because this is actually in her own writing. But Marnie talks about the benefits of circuits, the COGRAM program, are that I'm encouraged to remember things in my everyday life, such as phone numbers or people's names. As I'm asked after each task what the difficulty was and what strategies I used, I'm encouraged to be more aware of my thought processes. One of the strategies used for tasks is visualizing, and I've found that it's easier to remember a number of objects or a group of numbers by closing my eyes and visualizing the objects or numbers. The project circuit is very colourful and easy to use. You're given a demonstration before attempting the talk. This makes it easier to follow the task instructions. When I first started circuits, I was a little apprehensive, but the tasks are at a manageable level, so my confidence has grown. So that's a really great endorsement from someone who's really benefited from the program. And I'll just finish by saying that we really hope that this project will result in many more people like Marnie gaining access to COGREM so that recovery-focused therapies can become core to the care that we can deliver in public mental health services. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you for the questions that are coming in on Slido. If you want to elevate a question, you can vote for it, and we'll make sure that in the time we've got available, we're asking the questions that are most relevant. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dan Siskind. So Dan trained as a psychiatrist in Australia and the United States. He works clinically as a psychiatrist in Brisbane with people with treatment-refractory schizophrenia. His research also includes clozapine and the physical health comorbidities associated with schizophrenia. He has over 250 publications and over $50 million in competitive research grants with over $6.5 million as chief investigator. Dan is on the board of Psychosis Australia and heads up the Research Advisory Council. So please welcome Dan.
So with Tony's comments, it's nepotism, which is why I got to get the keynote. It's all right. All right, so g'day, I'm Dan. I'm a psychiatrist here in beautiful sunny Brisbane, and for those of you who are not from here, you can see why we live here. This is winter, and it's a real pleasure to be presenting here today at this conference. And one of the things I've most enjoyed has been the tea breaks, where I've got to talk to people who are clinicians and researchers and people with lived experience, or people who love someone with a lived experience. And I love that we're all together in the room. So I'm going to get a little bit biological today. I will show you my bias there, but I just want to put that out there that we're going to talk a bit about some clinical science here. I've got to thank the people who've been involved in clinical trials with me. So the first people I want to thank is the participants, the people who've done clinical trials, my amazing clinical trials team, many of whom are here today, my colleagues at my clinical service and my university, and some of my amazing postdocs. I have got a declaration. I sit on a Viatris quality assurance committee that chooses who can get re-challenged on clozapine, and I've got some grant support, and I'd like to acknowledge additional owners. So there's two things I'm going to tell you about today. First of all, about treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and then around physical health comorbidity, which are the two areas of the clinical work I do and the consumers that I serve and my research. So treatment-resistant schizophrenia, some people call this complex schizophrenia, and I know that this can be quite a emotionally charged term. I know that some people can feel that that's putting an onus on the consumer of not meeting the bidding of my treatment. I put the onus on myself, because when I've got a consumer who's not had the relief from the symptoms that they want, that's on me to work harder in terms of research and clinical work to help them achieve the response that they're looking for. And so when we define this concept of treatment-resistant schizophrenia, it's usually defined as people who've had 2 adherent trials of a medication, but have got ongoing symptoms. But most importantly, they've got functional deficits, because it's not the symptoms, it's whether or not people are achieving their life goals. And when we've looked at the data sets, including from some of Julia's data sets from the ASOP data set, about 1/4 to 1/3 of people who have schizophrenia will go on to develop treatment-resistant symptoms. So that's a really big proportion of the people that I serve. So I'm going to tell you now about a hero. So we've got every story, it's got to have an origin story, it's got to have a hero. Can anyone tell me who this in the cartoon is? The image is? Wolverine. Okay, great. We've got some science fiction fans here. I've got some teenage children, so I get to watch Origin X-Men again and claim it's for their benefit. So clozapine came about in 1958. Can anyone tell me what the first antipsychotic was? Chlorpromazine, thank you. And what year did chlorpromazine get developed? Yeah, 53, 52. So clozapine's been around for almost as long as our very first antipsychotic. It is 67 years old, much like Wolverine. It's sort of evergreen, stays fresh. It's still our strongest. But much like Wolverine, it had some problems. Can anyone tell me what the problems were in the 70s? So people developed neutropenia. So we have a very strict monitoring protocol, and it got taken off the market around the world, but got reintroduced in Australia. And so this is a study which looks at the rate of clozapine use in a number of countries around the world. And is this the laser? Oh, no, I want to go this way. Laser, okay, wonderful. So Finland's got the most usage. Australia's kind of in the middle of the pack with around 60 people per 100,000 population. We're just in the process of replicating this study because it's about a decade old. But now I'm going to remap this. So this is the proportion of people who've got treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and there we go. There's clozapine usage in Australia. So, and this clozapine usage in Australia is people ever got offered one dose of it. So, less than a quarter of the people who've got treatment-resistant schizophrenia are ever offered by their clinician access to this very effective medication, which I think is a real onus on me to do a better job about helping conserve the consumers that I work for. So why would I be so enthusiastic about offering it? So in terms of reducing positive symptoms of psychosis, it's our most effective medication. If I was giving this lecture to a group of hospital administrators, I would tell them this: it keeps people out of hospital. So in the year before you start clozapine versus the year after starting clozapine, consumers have on average about 34 fewer days in hospital. And I spend a lot of time talking to the loved ones of people who are considering starting clozapine, and it's this data that I talk to people about. People who take clozapine are twice as likely to live. They are half as likely to die, and that's driven by a huge reduction in suicide, but also a reduction in all-cause mortality, because people are more well and they're more engaged in their physical health care. So it really is quite a transformative medication. So I've got a little clozapine Rorschach here. So who would describe themselves as an optimist? Who's an optimistic? Okay, great, we've got some optimists. I would hope that at a psychosis conference we'd have some optimists. Okay, so you guys might look at this and say, all right, the person's taking clozapine, their symptoms are relieved, the better angels have come, and there's a positive future here for them. Now, some people might be considered pessimists. Now, pessimists never call themselves pessimists, they call themselves realists. So anyone here a pessimist or a realist? One honest person in the entire room. Okay, Alison, obviously. Okay, so they might see the pills have fallen over, the medication's on the floor. It's possible this consumer has chosen not to take their medications and perhaps having a relapse. So a little Rorschach here as to how you view this. Okay, so I've told you about the benefits of clozapine, but it does have some physical health side effects, which are really serious, and that kind of occupies most of my clinical work, is managing these. So Mr. Casey has provided me consent to tell his story, but it's not his real initials. Does anyone recognise who this is? Kurt Cobain, thank you. I do lectures to medical students, and they've never heard of Kurt Cobain. All right. I'm so old. All right. So Mr. Casey was a consumer who I've worked with for 17 years. He is incredibly bright. He got a scholarship to a university, studied IT. He moved to another city down south where he worked in the IT sector and was very successful, living independently, living the good life, until he was in his mid-20s when he first started developing psychotic symptoms. By the time I met him was around 5 years later, and he was living in a really substandard hostel, tortured by his auditory hallucinations. He'd had a very close relationship with his family, which had been ruptured because of his difficulty in accepting their love and the challenges they had interpersonally, and he was very lonely. And he got a housing support package. He's got his own house, and started living independently, and then went to the emergency department with a sore shoulder, but heard the person in the waiting room talking about wanting to rape his sister, so assaulted him. And that was an auditory hallucination he was responding to, and he got started on clozapine. And after starting on clozapine, he used to play field hockey when he was younger. He started playing Masters field hockey. He loved music. He was really into the Seattle grunge scene, and he started playing guitar again, and he found a music teacher who used to be the guitarist in Helmet, who he played Helmet for me. It wasn't my choice of music. They were a little bit heavier than I could handle, but he took pleasure from this. He was able to watch television again because it was no longer about him. He was able to listen to music again because it was no longer about him. And he was having this real quality of life. He'd reconnected with his family, and the love they'd always had to each other, towards each other had been reconnected. But he went from looking like Kurt Cobain to looking like Jumpsuit Elvis. And moreover, I caused his diabetes because of the adrenergic treatments that I was providing with him because he was on clozapine. And so Mr. KC has kind of really been one of the instrumental focuses of my research career is how do I prevent this kind of thing happening again? Let me rephrase that. How do I help people on their functional journey towards recovery, but how do I not wreck their bodies? Because we know that clozapine has a lot of metabolic side effects. It causes about 11 kilograms of weight gain over the first 5 years. It causes very high rates of dyslipidemia. Almost half of people develop diabetes over the first 10 years of starting clozapine, and it's got the worst metabolic side effect profile of all antipsychotics. And that's over and above a lot of the physical health comorbidity that people with schizophrenia already face. They're twice as likely to develop cardiovascular disease. If you adjust for age and gender, they're 3 times as likely to die at any age group. And I know that Psychosis Australia and Alison Young have done some really great work around promoting physical health with some of the conferences we've had previously, but it still remains an issue. They've got a 16-year mortality gap for people with schizophrenia. So what's driving this mortality gap? Well, there's a few things. Part of it is genetic. We know that even before anyone with first episode psychosis has had a first antipsychotic medication, they've already got abnormal glucose tolerance, and this was a large meta-analysis done by Toby Pillinger. So people are already developing glucose homeostasis problems even before they've started antipsychotic medications. For those of you who got to hear Mike Trott present around physical activity, people with psychosis are far more likely to be sedentary. And so I'm a little bit sick this week, so I'm not wiggling around as much as I normally do, but normally I'm sort of like Julia when I present, dancing around the stage. So most of us are kind of moving around all the time. But for people with psychosis, and people with schizophrenia, they're very still. And so a lot of that incidental movement isn't happening. So compared to, and so most of us sit down a lot, about 8 hours a day. People with schizophrenia are sitting down and being still around 11 hours a day, and they're more still when they're still. When we look at diet, and I know Donnie Johnson presented some of this work around diet and people with schizophrenia earlier today, but people have higher energy, higher sodium intake, lower fruit and vegetable intake, greater consumption of takeaway and convenience foods, and more sugar and sweetened drinks. I'll just skip over these ones, just because we're moving out of time. So we know that dietary interventions work. So if we offer people dietary interventions, it leads to a sort of increased weight loss, decrease in BMI, decrease in waist circumference, improvements in blood glucose. But they're better if they're dietitian-led, and not all of our clinical services have dietitians on board. And so I've often gone to see a dietitian about my weight, and I've got to go see them, and I come back in a week, and I've written down everything that I've eaten, and I've been very good. But as soon as I no longer have to see the dietitian, well, no one's watching what I'm eating anymore except me. And so dietitian interventions work really well if they're commenced at the time of antipsychotic initiation. Physical activity, people with schizophrenia, it does really well involved with activity programs. It decreases psychotic symptoms, improves people's anthropometric measures, their weight, their BMI, improves sleep, cognition, and quality of mood, but there's some challenges with uptake. So do any of you guys remember the Swap It, Don't Stop It campaign the Australian government ran about 10 years ago, which said, instead of this delicious bowl of spaghetti and meatballs, why don't we have a salad? And so Australians leapt towards that opportunity, and none of you had any of the delicious cakes at lunchtime, all of you had the salad. And then exercise. And so it can be really challenging to motivate people with exercise. Gosh knows, it's hard enough for me. I have a personal trainer who comes to my house once a week, and every morning I'm thinking, I'll just pull up the blankets a little bit higher and not go and see him. So I need to have someone standing over me. And so it can be hard to encourage people to do exercise. So let's talk about some psychopharmacology approaches, given we've got some biological issues with clozapine causing weight gain. Can anyone tell me who this handsome chap is? It's a lizard. A lizard is good. That's great. Anyone tell me what type of lizard? A monitor. It's a Gila monitor. That's right. It's a Gila monitor. And so Gila monitors live in the southwest of the United States, in the deserts of New Mexico, where there's not a lot to eat. And so they'll only get a mouse every sort of, couple of months. And so they need to manage their appetite and manage their blood glucose. And they do this by producing a salivary product called Exendin, which is a glucagon-like 1 peptide, which manages it. And so scientists discovered a few years back that this peptide can be used to help manage people's blood sugar. So Tony very kindly organised for a scientific experiment at lunchtime. So he gave all of you a glycemic load. We call that food or lunch. Yeah. And when you had your glycemic load, it did a few things. So it went into your intestines. It kind of worked its way through till your terminal ileum, which is kind of the lower part of your small intestine. And when the food got there, it produced this peptide called glucagon-like peptide 1. And so it did a few things. So first of all, it said to Tony, you're full. You don't need to keep eating. There's already food in your stomach. It also told your body to get ready for glucose. So it told your pancreas, get ready. We're going to start producing, you've got to start producing insulin soon. There's sugars about to come into your bloodstream. It told the gut to slow down so it can take more time to absorb the food. It told your liver, which is a store of fast glucose, don't produce glucose right now. All right? We've already got glucose coming in. We don't need to pump more glucose in there. And so it got the muscles and the other cells ready for glucose to absorb it when the insulin came. And so it does a lot of work around glucose regulation. So a colleague of mine in Sydney who works also with Julia, Greg Smith, he did some animal studies where he gave animals clozapine, olanzapine, or quetiapine, and found it caused a lot of glucose dysregulation in these animals. They had a high-fat, high-chow diet craving, but when he gave them Exendin, or these GLP-1s, receptor agonists, as an injection, it normalized their blood glucose. And so this is what's happening in people who take clozapine, olanzapine, or quetiapine. To Greg's credit, he said, I'm going to give these animals olanzapine. I should try it myself. And he took 20 milligrams of olanzapine in clinic, had to call his wife because he couldn't work out how to get to the car because he was so tired. I kind of respect animal scientists who aren't afraid to experiment on themselves. All right. But so in people, we know that clozapine, olanzapine, quetiapine in particular cause this glucose dysregulation because they interrupt the GLP-1 cycle. And there was a consumer that I served for many years, and my team leader would always bake him a casserole for his birthday, and a very large casserole, and the idea that he'd have food for a week. But this gentleman was on clozapine, and he'd eat it in one setting because he didn't get that biological feedback to tell him he was full. He would just keep on eating. So it made us think, well, maybe we should be doing some studies of GLP-1s in people who are on clozapine. So this was a study I did a few years back on an early GLP-1 called exenatide. It was one of the first ones that came on the market. And so it was an open label study. People knew what they were on. People were randomized. It was a small study. We randomized 28 people. 14 people were on the control, 14 people were on exenatide. But because it was open label, one of the consumers who was on the control arm said, screw you, Dan, I want to lose weight. So she went and joined a dragon boat racing team, and she lost about 10 kilos. And as her psychiatrist, I was so proud of her. But as a clinical trialist, it was frustrating. And so what we can see here, that people lost weight on the exenatide arm. They lost about 5.5 kilos. Almost all the weight loss on the treatment as usual arm was that one person. She did so well. And we found that when we looked at a meta-analysis of other studies of similar studies like exenatide, people lost weight, they lost BMI, and it was very effective for people on clozapine. Since that time, some newer GLP-1 receptor agonists have come on the market, and there's one called semaglutide, which was very effective in helping people with diabetes lose weight at a low dose and a high dose. And then it was really effective for people who didn't have diabetes to lose weight. So these were people who were apologies, who didn't have diabetes, who had a raised BMI, and they were randomized to placebo or semaglutide. And after 68 weeks, they'd lost about 16% of their body weight, which is about 12.5% more than the placebo group. So really effective at losing body weight. I was going to show you a silly video, but I'll move on today because we'll get to the science. Do you want to see the silly video? Oh, wow, okay. I may go over time, Tony. So to remind you about the Hollow Men, this was a TV show about a bunch of craven craven ministerial advisors who are helping the Prime Minister. And in this particular episode, someone has come to the Prime Minister who's a massive donor for the Prime Minister's political party and wants to get their drug put on the PBS. And these guys are going to try and work it out. And so the metaphor here is we've got to do science to work out if we should be supporting the use of drugs. All right.
Sorry I'm late.
It's all right, mate. What's up?
You ever heard of a drug called Insules?
Nope.
It's for treating diabetes.
Type 1 or type 2?
I don't know, is that important?
I don't know.
Nick, you ever heard of a drug called Insules?
Oh, I get a lot of spam. Does this one make your pants thicker or longer?
Nice one, Jim. Good. Well, look at all the research you're doing. I mean, I'm impressed.
Hang on, Insules has been trialled overseas.
Overseas? I mean, we're halfway there. Where?
In the States.
And?
I'm just waiting for the page to load.
I mean, is this an FDA thing or a...
Oprah.
Oh.
She had a medical breakthrough show.
Right.
And is Insules a medical breakthrough?
Exciting new development. Apparently you don't feel as bloated.
Well, that's something. Do we send a tape across to the PBS?
I think we're going to need something a little bit more credible than Oprah, mate.
Did Dr. Phil mention it?
I'll check. How much did she lose?
17 kilos,
That's from taking Insules.
apparently.
And that had nothing to do with her cocaine addiction.
They don't mention it.
Oh, look.
Nick, let's roll.
My mum's auntie lives in America. She's going to get some sent out.
It doesn't work.
She says it does. It was on Oprah.
All right. So you guys did ask for that. I want to point that out. So one of the things that's interesting about the clinical trials that have involved semaglutide is that specifically they excluded people with schizophrenia. And that's pretty common in a lot of the general health trials. People with schizophrenia are excluded. So we wanted to know whether or not this would work among people with schizophrenia on clozapine. And Dr. Phil saying it wasn't enough for us. So we did this 36-week investigator-initiated double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial. 36 weeks means the trial ran for 36 weeks. Investigator-initiated means that no drug company would give me money. I had to kind of come up with the idea myself and get grants. Double-blind meant that I didn't know what consumers were on and participants didn't know what they were on. And randomised meant we used a randomisation process to decide whether or not people got the intervention or the control. So we included adults with schizophrenia who'd been on clozapine for 18 weeks, who had stable body weight because it was a small study, we didn't have lots and lots of money, and the more variation there is at baseline, the less likely you are to find statistically significant results. So that was one of the natures of not having lots of money. People who were overweight or obese and who didn't have diabetes, and we excluded people with diabetes because if you had diabetes, you could already get this drug under the PBS, and I do not think it's reasonable to randomise someone who could get the drug anyway to placebo. We were aiming to recruit 80 people and we were primarily looking at change in body weight over 36 weeks. Now this QR code will take you to the published study. If you're interested, that QR code I think will pop up again a bit later if you miss it. Okay. So things were going well, we were recruiting strongly, but then the Met Gala happened. And Elon Musk and Kim Kardashian were looking fantastic at the Met Gala and suddenly everybody was on Ozempic, and there was a global shortage, and I could not buy this drug for love or money. We actually had to stop the trial early because I could not purchase the study compound. So we managed to screen 168 people. We allocated 31 people to the intervention to control. One person in the active arm stopped because they had diarrhea, and 3 people in the placebo arm stopped because they said, I'm not losing weight. Why am I doing your study? And so we analysed 36 people. So the people we recruited kind of looked like people who go to clozapine clinics. They were majority male. They had an age around 38, 39 years. There'd been a fair bit of time before they had started clozapine between the commencement of their illness. But other than that, they were all pretty similar. And here's what we found. The people who were on the placebo group lost about 0.42% of their body weight, whereas people in the active arm lost 13.88% of their body weight. So that's a 13.46% greater weight loss. When we look at their percentage change in weight over time, because of the nature of this particular medication, semaglutide, you've got to titrate it because you can feel a bit nauseous on the first couple of days after the injection, so you want to slowly titrate up the dose over around 16 weeks. And you can see as the dose gets titrated, people will start losing weight faster and faster until they've lost around, again, 15% of their body weight by the 36 weeks. When we look at proportion of people who lost more than 10% of their body weight, so 10% is sort of a fairly high threshold of body weight loss, you can see that no one in the placebo arm lost more than 10% of their body weight, and around 70% of the people in the semaglutide group had lost 10% of their body weight. In terms of BMI, we had a reduction in BMI and we had a reduction in HbA1c. HbA1c is a measure of blood sugar. Now, it doesn't cause hypoglycemia, this drug, unlike insulin, because you've got to have food to make it work, so don't feel like this is causing people to be hypoglycemic. Now, the other thing that's been a big concern about these drugs is where are people losing weight? Are they losing muscle or are they losing fat? And so what we know for people who are on antipsychotic medications, the fat deposition is what we call an android or bloke type fat. So you can see for me, I'm demonstrating for you, I've got some central obesity here, but I don't have a lot of fat on my arms, and I've got great legs, but you can't see them today. And so people were losing fat mass in the active arm compared to the placebo. The body fat percentage was going down, but more importantly, it was visceral fat that people were losing. Now, people did lose muscle mass, but nowhere near as much fat mass. But it does highlight the importance of exercise and diet when people are taking these medications. So the trial had been sort of going on for a while and it was publicly facing. So I got a lot of emails from people with schizophrenia or their loved ones saying, well, is this going to make their psychosis worse, or is this going to make their clozapine levels abnormal? And I can reassure you, people's people's psychosis symptoms didn't change with the intervention compared to the placebo, that we weren't really powered to show change. And we've got another larger trial going on for a new drug called tirzepatide, which hopefully will be able to more clearly tease out if there's an impact on psychosis symptoms. But more importantly, clozapine levels weren't impacted, so it didn't impact absorption. We had hoped this drug would improve cognition, and as Julia pointed out, cognition really is something that the consumers I serve tell me is an important issue for them. We didn't really see any change in cognition, but again, we weren't powered to detect that. The thing that I was really concerned about was constipation, because constipation is the number1 killer for people on clozapine. It is the #1 cause of mortality, and I was worried that constipation rates would go up because this drug does slow down gut motility. But what we actually found is that diarrhea rates went up among people who are on it, and we didn't see an increase in constipation between the two groups, and this was not something that people were concerned about. And we really asked very detailed questions about people's bowel habits, so we didn't mess around with this one. We took that very seriously. But the main concern was around nausea, and that was, no one dropped out because of their concerns around nausea. Everyone found that completely tolerable, which was reassuring. So when we looked at the weight loss at 36 weeks compared to the people in the general population, so 13.5% weight loss at 36 weeks at a slightly lower dose than some of the other trials had, and that was because we didn't have that much money to be able to buy enough drug, so versus 12.4%. So I did wonder whether or not it was more effective in people with schizophrenia than the general population, and I submitted this to a credible journal, and they said, Dan, you can't say that. You didn't have enough participants. But that is something for us to explore, because I think we hypothesise that because of the impact of clozapine on GLP-1, we'll be more effective. All right, so the core messages. People there's the QR code for the paper if you wanted to get that, if you didn't get that before. Significant and clinically meaningful weight loss, low rates of adverse drug reactions, very acceptable, no impact on clozapine levels or psychosis symptoms, no impact on cognition. We're doing a 1-year follow-up. I have horrible fears that people are going to gain a lot of that weight back after stopping the trial, which is why we've been trying to lobby the PBS to make this a priority group to get this. And we had a lot of media when the article came out, and people said, we said, look, we'd love the PBS to fund it, and the PBS issued a statement and said no. So campaigning has got to keep on going. Your voices will be really important if you think this is important for people on antipsychotics. We're going to do some more trials to see if we can find more effective treatments. Thank you so much.